Vidal's penthouse apartment in Rome is a salon for an assortment of Romans, aristocrats and artists, film stars and models, politicians and writers. And they like to hear his gossip about his contemporaries.
I saw Scott Fitzgerald ruin himself. He took movies seriously. It's not writing.
Fitzgerald wrote one perfect novel, which The Great Gatsby, but the rest of it was kind of sad.
Tennessee was given to fits of paranoia. I called it his night-blooming dementia precox. And the bird, as I always called him, the bird would go through these phases. I believe that Gore is trying to undo me. And so, confronted with this terrible news, I said, well, if I wanted to, where could I do it? Oh, he said, your connections with the New York Times are notorious. I said, yes, they are notorious, but they're all negative. I have no powers there. Well, then why didn't my late review of Paul Bowles get printed? I said, you rang them about it. They said they had published it, and they said they had sent you a copy of your published review. Have you forgotten? Oh, yes, well, I've been so busy lately. And then he would go into hypochondria.
I have a very low view of Hemingway. I mean, he's a sort of field and stream writer whose gift for publicity, has propelled him ever forward. He didn't develop.
For Whom the Bell Tolls.
That really is bad romantic fiction.
For Whom the Bell Tolls!
And a very embarrassing book, which I think even he came to realize toward the end. Mind you, they made extremely good, serious, in quotes, movies. And perhaps he was, as a source of movies...
The Sun Also Rising?
No, I don't think there's much. I mean, all right, you want to talk about him. How does he compare with Thomas Mann? How does he compare with James Joyce? These are all contemporaries.
Hemingway and so on, these are really, for the most part, these are people who are show-offs. They know nothing of literature. Do you think Ernest Hemingway deserves anything other than our tears for having been such a fool? I mean, Hemingway was a hopeless writer, but who would care? Because you had to know about writing before you could judge Hemingway, wouldn't you?
Mailer, I think, is absolutely an atrocious personality. But by atrocious, I mean his absolutely demented machismo.
I was very fond of Norman Mailer.
That's why I think he's like a VFW commander in Schenectady.
We were friends for 100 years, it seems. We have Norman Mailer here, who really should be in the typist pool somewhere. There's a nice picture, if you like pictures, of Mailer and me in Vanity Fair. There's a good journalist there called Walcott, James Walcott. Walcott was looking around for the great voices of American literature to speak against the war in the Middle East and so on.
I first met Norman Mailer in 1950. I criticized his book, The Prisoner of Sex. The words failed Norman Mailer.
But we expected to be read by everybody, and so we had something for everybody. He left such an empty space behind him because he didn't have much competition. I met him early, and he was honking away, selling his wares. Norman and I always wrote for a vast audience, far larger than any audience we ever had. John Updike, I'm sure he's a very nice person, but there's nothing to be learned from his books.
The last time I sat on this stage, I think in this chair, I was afflicted by, I felt like the Pharaoh of Egypt, by a fly. It was an awful fly. Every time I started to talk, it was, and I kept missing it and missing it. And then you remember that movie, The Fly, in which there's a little voice comes out and says, "Help, help." I realized it was the late Truman Capote had come back.
Is it actually true that when he died and you were told about it that you said, a wise career move?
I told that to my publisher privately, and of course I had to read it every day for the next 10 years.
Getting back to Capote again, did you say what I heard you had said when he died?
Well, I said it, but Truman had ridden on ahead and crossed the shining river. And I did say, well, that was a good career move.
So you did say.
I got full credit for having been stony-hearted at the loss of a confrère. Without price, the greatest jewel, the greatest zircon in the diadem of American literature.
I did send, I've got a good bit in this book about Johnny Carson, who was a great friend, and the only man who gave us satire on television, and no one now is doing pretty well with it, but Carson was brilliant with the monologue, the opening monologue. And suddenly there was Truman. He's about to celebrate his 59th birthday. And he was staying with Johnny's ex-wife, Joanne Carson. And he dies there. It's a very sad story, and I was publicly grieving, naturally. Sackcloth, ashes, you know, I do the whole thing. I don't just play around with mourning. And the word was spreading all around, and the newspapers were ringing me to see what I would say, and I was terribly benign. I didn't say much of anything. And then I sent Johnny Carson a message. I said, I promise that I'll die in your house. He was the most illegitimate literary figure we ever produced. He was also a consummate liar. He never stopped lying. And I finally took him to court. I sued him for libel, and I won. And he has to print a huge apology to me in one of his very last books.
Truman Capote has spent most of his life trying to get into a world with some success that I have spent most of my life trying with some success to get out of.
Did you see Christopher Hitchens?
No.
He's here.
Christopher Hitchens thought he could be the new Vidal and declared himself to be my dauphin, my heir. And I said, yeah, forget it. I said, I'm still in business, and I shall be in business as long as you're alive. I said with a beady look. Well, how's the
reverence?
How is the poo?
May I anoint the brow?
As Christopher Hitchens appointed himself my heir years ago, and I found him a very bright kid. I first knew him when he was about 20 in England as a New Statesman. We both wrote for it. And he's had a sea change. So he is no longer my heir. The Dauphin, I used to call him, or Delfino, which is the word for dolphin in Italian.
How about Christopher Hitchens? Do you enjoy his writing?
No.
No.
I'm not an Al Franken fan. I mean, he's a comedian who never made anybody laugh. He's a writer who never wrote anything worth reading, but just went around talking about how he's going to be elected to the Senate from Minnesota. And he got that. I'll hand it to him. But I don't see him being very useful. Minnesota, to me, means La Follette. That was absolutely the most stimulating place in America. Progressives, the farm labor. It's a serious state. Along comes Jack Kennedy, and Jack was very bright about many things, but he was brought up without much imagination about the rest of the world and without much knowledge of the rest of the world. But Jack was a quick learner. But he arrived with all these right-wing views. Where Eisenhower and Truman were two old, tough politicians, neither Truman nor Eisenhower believed in the threat of world communism.
What is your current relationship with Mrs. Onassis, your stepsister?
She had no interest in anything but herself. It is not noble.